Hey guys, in this video I'll be sculpting these stylized barrels in Zbrush. I'll be commenting on what I am doing, my thought processes, and what tools I am using as well. Now, if you guys are liking these videos, please support me by smashing that like button and subscribe. You can also do that over on Patreon as well. Now, let's get to it.
Alright, first thing, we import our OBJ that we exported from Blender. I had already saved this Zbrush file. What I'm doing right here is trying to figure out how to isolate. See my frames, my polygroups are all combined right now. So we'll be going down into our polygroups and auto grouping them. Now if you turn on polyframe like I did right there, you can see that all of them are in different polygroups, which makes it easier to isolate each individual mesh, each tool. Right now I'm just testing that out. I am going to auto split everything, and that way we can work on each part individually. So right here I am testing out the subdividing. So right there it did not subdivide like I wanted it to, so I turned off the smoothing for the first couple subdivisions and to create some geometry to make the subdividing smoother. And I could have fixed it a couple ways. I could have just added more edge loops, but these weren't that important, so I just decided to turn off the smoothing for the first couple of subdivisions and then turn it back on for the higher subdivisions. That way it keeps the form before it starts smoothing it out. Just checking everything. And I did it right here on the bottom, but later I just delete these bottom boards because I didn't really want to sculpt them again, and just reused the top boards for the bottom. I'm doing on the rings as well, and now checking out our bolts, making sure they subdivide smoothly as well. And I'm merging the groups together. I didn't want them all to be separated. Now everything is merged. I subdivided it to check out the smoothing, and it looks decent. Did the same thing where I turned off smoothing and turned it back on. So now I'm going to be adding some extra form into our model. I went back to the lowest subdivision, and you always want to go to the lowest subdivision when you're making large changes to your model, otherwise it's going to start looking lumpy. And I wanted to vary the top edge of this barrel to give it more uniqueness, right? Most barrels, if you're doing it realistically, they wouldn't be this fat. Also, they want to have a lot of variation on the top, but we're going for something stylized. So we have thicker proportions and trying to add some uniqueness that you wouldn't normally see in the real world or realistic video game art. So I'm just using the move tool right here. Something about the move tool is if you hold down the Alt key, it'll actually move it along its normals and not with the viewport. So if you're trying to move something and you can't get it quite how you want it, try holding down the Alt key as you're moving, and you will get a different result. Here I just added another subdivision level to see what the results would be, being smoother. Now I'm turning off the rings and the bolts. Got in a folder to organize these a little bit better. Organization is really important when you're working with a lot of objects, so you can figure out where things are. So I'm grouping things by like the boards, the rings and bolts. And one thing with the latest version of Zbrush, these folders hadn't been in Zbrush before, so it was kind of difficult to keep things organized. But you can actually duplicate the folders as well in this new version of Zbrush, and that allows you to kind of, like, if you need to make changes but you're not sure if you really want those changes, you can duplicate your folder, merge all the subtools together, and maybe make those changes. I do this all the time, especially when I start to make a low poly version. You'll see it later, where I will duplicate the mesh and merge all the subtools together and dynamesh it. After I do that, so the subtools kind of get fused together. It's great for making like porcelain objects, or getting a nice like connection, where things would be welded together, or just kind of a nice separation. It allows you to work on parts separately in the beginning and then fuse them together. Yeah, so I take the Warcraft brush and I spend the next hour or two just detailing every single one of these boards. And it's right here I switch back and forth between a trim dynamics and the Orbs crack brush. You'll also see me going into a lower subdivision to adjust the shape a little bit, and that way when you do the adjustments that way, you have cleaner geometry, cleaner subdivisions. But as I said, there's not a lot to this. Once you start working on one board, it's the same process for every single other board. You are just taking the trim dynamic, the Orbs crack brush, and just beating up the edges, carving in some unique detail. And you don't want to go too refined, especially with a stylized style. If you were working on a realistic game, your Call of Duties, you have a lot more details in these barrels. The boards are everything's gonna be realistic, right? Right now we have boards that are twice, 3 times the size of a normal board on a barrel. We have large chunky details. The thicker the cracks are, wider, and you have less cracks, but they read better at a smaller scale, and you got really large edge damage on these guys too, and that just keeps the noise down. Works better on smaller resolution on your phones, and it just creates that style that like Blizzard is known for, because everything is easily readable from a distance, and it has like a unique silhouette as well. Right here I enter the solo mode. That way we can actually work on the inside of the barrels, because I plan for the tops to be removed from some of the barrels, where either it'll be empty or we could add water into them, just have extra details. These are going to be blown up, destroyed, so we want details on the inside of the barrel too. And in Zbrush you have to hide everything else, or work in either ghost mode, so you can work on the inside, otherwise the brush isn't going to affect it. You'll notice that when you have geometry overlapping and you're not in a solo mode, the brushes will actually not affect your, they will not sculpt when other geometry is over what you're working on. Here I could have done a better job on my base geometry, so there's a lot of
extruding parts. They don't line up correctly. So if I'm doing cleanup right here. Now, if I did it correctly on the low poly, I wouldn't have had to do this cleanup. I'm using the trim brushes and to remove the geometry. Didn't do the best with the clip brushes, and so I just ended up dynameshing and going to the trim again, and didn't have the best results. There we go. Yeah, the trim curve is what I used, and save yourself some time, or do a little bit better job on your base geometry. Think ahead, and you won't have to do this particular step where you have to clean up like this. But yeah, I'm using right now. I switch back to trim dynamics for the brush and just clean up the edges. That way we have a good separation. And it just takes a while. There's nothing too special about this. It just takes a while. Here I'm using the trim dynamics again to give that bevel to the edges, and I also use pinch a little bit in here. There's also the orb slash, and sometimes your geometry doesn't fold right, and you just have to switch between the different brushes to give the details that you want. Yeah, back to the trim dynamics and just switching between them, and the orbs cracks. I tell you guys, it's a lot of doing the same thing over and over, and it's fun. I enjoy it and enjoy the process, but just looking back at this is like, it's not the craziest thing to do. It's you learn the process once, and then as you're just sculpting, you get better and better at it, knowing what you need to use when. I think maybe that's the real key. Just that practice, you figure out the best things to do in certain situations. Not all of the brushes could have similar results. You can use the standard brush or the damn standard brush to get these cracks, but the orb cracks just does a little bit better job, and he has 3 different types of cracks. They all do just something a little bit different. Building up some more variation in the edges on these boards. I thought they looked kind of not unique enough, and so I'll switch into a lower subdivision, move the geometry around, and then move is, if you want large changes, just the standard move brush is great for that. You can also use the alt key with the move brush to give a different, it's like a variation in your move. And I also will use the clay buildup to kind of cut away into these chunks right here, and then orb flatten as well. They all do something a little bit different, so you just learn what to use when. Sometimes I don't switch to the lower geometry mode, to the lower subdivision when I'm making the adjustments, but it just depends. And I'm using the orb slash right there to really cut into the edges. You don't have to use the orb slashes just for slashes. Like right there, I was using it for the cracks, to just separate the cracks a little bit better. And trim dynamic. When you're doing damage, trim dynamic is your best friend. It really is. Especially for stylized. I think if you do the further, more realistic damage, using the clay buildup, you can do nice, more realistic damage. Some more move brushing to give a little bit more unique edges, and then just trim dynamic and orb cracks over and over and over again. Sometimes you want to use your mask to change if you're having a problem either moving, or if your brushes are affecting parts of the geometry you don't want. You got to use your mask to do that. You can also H-polish. H-polish gives you nice divots. It's a very clean way to make a little more of an indent into your geometry. And now I'm using the orb flatten brush to vary those flat areas of the meshes, just to give a little bit of subtle plane changes. And it's just little details like this is kind of what sells it, right? It's just like a slight texture and nothing really overpowering, but just makes it look not quite as computer generated. And going with the orb slashes, and this is like when it gets really fun, in my opinion. Just going in, you don't want to get too detailed with stylized work, but it's just fun adding all these extra little subtle details that help sell the piece even more. You always have to think of like, where is the damage going to be? Most of the time it's going to be on the bottom. If you think that someone was dragging this barrel around, they would be knocking it up. You'd be getting scrapes, and the ground, the edges are where most of the damage is going to be. Now I'm starting to work on the middle bands, so I inflated the bands to give it a little bit more roundness, so it doesn't have a sharp edge like it did before. And back to trim dynamics. The trim dynamic brush works great for all sorts of material. Here I'm trying to give a little more of a wobbly edge, because when iron gets damaged, it's a little bit it's slightly different type of damage than wood. Iron rusts, it gets banged up, dented more, or since wood is a softer material, the type of damage looks a little bit different. So lots of just banged up, warped, um, damage, texture. I'm thinking about doing textures right now, right? So we have a little bit more of that, the plane variation in the metal, um, more like it's been hammered by a blacksmith. You just really want to think of, you know, when was this made? If it was made in a medieval time, you would have had a blacksmith hammering this out. You can get way more hammered if you want not quite as refined look. Um, the different, depending on what style you're going for, you can make this something metal way more hammered, warbly type feel to it. But I just wanted a little bit, nothing too crazy. Yeah, the orb flatten edge brush is great for this. So I am moving, just rotated the band around to kind of match. I realized I hadn't matched the band movement. Just since I rotated it, the slope of the band was different. It was off. So I scaled my mast. I scaled, and it's now kind of like pressing into the top to compensate for the adjustment I did, because didn't quite think about that when I made the base detail. Bringing the scaling, bringing the geometry closer. I thought it was a little bit too. Thought it stuck out a little bit too far. Right now, I'm masking the inner edges because we don't want those bands sticking through the wood. And backface masking. So when you are adding details like the orb slash, if you don't have backface masking turned on, the brush will affect the backside of your geometry, especially since it's a thinner board, right? If there was more space between the front and the back, it wouldn't have affected it, but it did, and I had to go clean it up. So another thing to be aware of, backface masking is important for when you have thinner geometry. And now I had to clean up all my geometry because I wasn't paying attention to those. And sometimes you just get into the zone. And I've been doing this for 7-8 years, and not everything I do is perfect. Obviously, I made quite a few mistakes in this video, but I know how to fix it up. So I am polishing, smoothing, then I go back and use the Orb's crack brush again to fill in the details I got softened. Now, trim dynamics again. Just going in and beating up those bolts like they were hammered in by a blacksmith. More cleanup. And I was experimenting with some different brushes to see how they affected the cleanup. have a if you did something like this and you had to have like really nice clean geometry, if you didn't, if the texture mattered a lot more, say on a person's face, you may have to redo all those details. It depends on the look you're going for. So back to beating up those bolts, and they stuck too far out, so definitely smushing them into the geometry, into the bands more. And they'll take a little while. I soften them up using the smooth. Um, just they were a little bit too sharp for the trim dynamics to work as nice. Oh, I see an error that I made, and now I have to go fix it again. Mask it, had to move it out, and then smooth and trim dynamics to soften it back up, or to make it a little better transition. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. And I think that's something you really have to realize. You're going to make mistakes while you're working on the 3D art. Just like anything you do, you're going to make mistakes. And don't let that stop you from trying, right? But learning, it's all about making mistakes. If you didn't make mistakes, you wouldn't be doing your best work. It's better to try, make mistakes, than not try at all. Now, I could have made it a little bit quicker by duplicating the bolts. So I could have beat up a few bolts, a few sets, and then just duplicated them and rotated them around, and you wouldn't have noticed that the bolts were the same. It happens all the time in games. You duplicate the geometry and you just rotate it, do scale changes, and the players never know that you only made one sculpt of a bolt, or like 4 or 5 when there's 30 bolts. I didn't really want to try to align everything back up after doing it, but it wouldn't have been too difficult to do. And I had a little bit more pleasure in smashing the bolts together. So I am adjusting the thin sides again because they were sticking through the planks. I'm just using using Z modeler to mask. And just the nice new gizmos that the latest versions of Zbrush have made it a lot easier to scale and adjust. So since I used the masking and I did scale, the geometry kind of overlapped, and I'm just smoothing that out right there. And the nice thing, Zbrush is, since you go to those lower subdivisions, you make those changes, it keeps all your details, but it can't predict everything, so I had to go in here and just clean up the adjustments I did with the scale. So the scale, I was using a mask, and scaling things, there's some problems when I went back to the highest subdivision. I just had to go and clean that up. Now, right here, I'm just checking to make sure everything looks good. Found out that I needed to do a little more details. And also realized since I'm going to breaking up this into pieces, I need to do the inside of the rings as well, because I wanted variations where you have a nice barrel all intact, but then you have broken barrels, and since they're going to be broken, you're going to see the inside of all of the geometry. So we had to put details on the inner rings as well. So it's going to be the same thing. We're going to do trim dynamic, some smoothing. Because of the scaling I did, some of the geometry smushed onto the edges. I had to smooth that geometry out for the trim dynamic brush to work better. So just since the slope, since it's curved differently than the outside of the bands, the brushes were affecting the mesh in a different way, and that's why I decided to use a few different brushes. You'll see that I was using the orb hammered and dragging that out onto the mesh, but I turned down the intensity really low. It's just to give that subtle hint, and then I went back over it with the trim dynamics brush to clean it up, just because I really wanted it to be just a subtle texture. And checking the shapes, seeing if I need to do anything else. Alright, so here I am organizing my folders, and so I duplicated them, merged them together for some of them, and I am now going to decimate my geometry. The reason I duplicated them is because once you decimate them, you don't have clean geometry anymore if you wanted to change anything later. So renamed the folders, and yeah, so I have top boards there. Just make sure. There we go. I named it. Saving the project before I decimate. I'm going to decimate every single one. Go up to the Z plugin, pre-process all. It takes a little bit of time. Can take a lot of time. But once it's all done, we will have some lower polygon geometry that we can actually import into your 3D package of choice. So all the pre-processing was done. Now it is going to decimate it all. Then I export it to a OBJ. I export all of the high poly decimated meshes to an OBJ, and then in the next video I will be importing all of them into Blender and adjusting and making the low poly meshes. So we had made a base mesh before to start our sculpt, and now we will be using that base mesh and adjusting it to match our high poly mesh, and you can see that in the next video.
Thanks for watching that video. If you made it all the way through, more power to you. I know it was long. If I can help you guys out in any way, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. And I hope you guys have an amazing day. Thanks.